finance function has evolved from the transactional support to strategic leadership down to more requirements such as business acumen, providing insight to stakeholders, stakeholder management as well. So there's a need for every finance professional to continue to evolve. My name is Oyekemi Ajayi. I'm going to be talking about strategic influence for finance professionals. Follow me as I go into this round of presentation. Thank you. As a finance professional, there's a need for you to understand how to manage your stakeholders, build trust with these stakeholders, and influence outcomes. Before you say you're building trust or you're able to manage stakeholders, you need to understand each stakeholder and what the landscape, the language of the stakeholder is, what they require. You need to understand all that. Now, strategic influence begins with clarity on who these key players are and what they want in a business. Your stakeholder group would include your CEO, your board of directors, the regulators, the lenders or investors, the business leaders or partners that you have in the business, employees, suppliers, and a lot more. A couple of these stakeholder groups require clarity, particularly on their expectations and priorities. So you need to map each stakeholder group to these questions that I'm going to be telling you about. The first is, what do they want from the business? How do they evaluate success? And what type of language resonates with them? This stakeholder mapping becomes the foundation of your next line of action or your strategies in the business. Let's look at the communication, strategic communication for each of these stakeholders. To be able to effectively influence your stakeholders as a finance professional, you need to understand what they require and how to tailor your communication to suit this set of stakeholders or this audience. Now, what do I mean by this? You need to understand that there is a shift from financial language to stakeholder-specific language. In practical terms, you need to understand if I am communicating to the suppliers or to investors, what are the things that they require to know? What are the information that I need to pass across to them? So the what if information is highly recommended in this instance, and that is where you start from, not going into the numbers or the analysis. The second point is to use value-anchored framing, which helps you to connect your financial insights to the strategic goal that the organization is seeking to achieve. The third point is to simplify complexities. So instead of, putting up all numbers, you may want to use visuals backed by narratives to pass your message across. And then you need to adapt tone and detail. So at board level, for example, they require high-level messages. So if you are looking at your regulators as well, they need precision. Lenders as well, they need clarity. So take all these things into perspective when you are communicating with the stakeholders. Let's look at how to balance growth, governance, and risk. One of the biggest tests that finance leaders have is managing the tension between stakeholders and their conflicting priorities. In a real sense, a CEO can push for aggressive expansion, and the regulator would demand compliance. The investors would want dividend. All these things are requirements by these stakeholders. But how do you manage all this? The first point is to understand that, okay, if I'm dealing with the board, how do I frame information as it relates to impact, as it relates to risk, and as it relates to time management? You may also want to consider storytelling, because if you're dealing with the board, for example, you may be looking at historical information vis-a-vis future telling, meaning your forecast. So you need to be able to tie both together. Of course, what will happen in the future might be different from what will happen historically, but you may need to carry out some historical analysis to be able to estimate or make some forecasts ahead of whatever goals you are looking to achieve. Another point I'd like to mention here is using scenario storytelling, especially when you are dealing with high-level senior people. You need to be able to present options, the implications, the pros and cons, the impacts that is going to have on the business. So as a finance professional, you must be familiar with impact analysis and be able to communicate this to your stakeholders depending on the situation and what you are looking to achieve. And the final point of this is risk framing. Position risk as a strategic asset, not a barrier. But then again, you must be able to understand how to mitigate this risk and what your business needs to do to move to the next level, taking into consideration these risk factors. Now, one point I like to emphasize is that influence comes from offering clarity and not just simplifying issues. Influence comes from offering clarity. On a final note, it is very important that you map your stakeholders. Map them into groups, understand what they require, the type of information that is required, and most importantly, remember that influence comes from offering clarity and choices, not simply raising issues. Every stakeholder in the business demands clarity, demands information. Integrity is also the watchword of everything. So whatever information you are passing, integrity must be held strictly as a finance professional, and then understand the stakeholder requirements and how the communication would be done to help you achieve your objective. I hope this has been very helpful, and I hope you've been able to understand what you need to do in managing your stakeholders. Thank you very much for your time, and you have a great one.